everyone. Welcome back to Adherent Apologetics. So glad you're joining us today. Today I'm joined by Dr. Craig Evans, a distinguished professor of Christian origins at Houston Baptist University. Today we're going to be talking about his recent book, Jesus in the Manuscripts, and all kinds of fun questions about what can we learn from the Gospels and the earliest manuscripts about Jesus. So, Dr. Evans, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, you're welcome, Zach.
Awesome. I'm really looking forward to this conversation and just talking about what can we learn about Christ through the Gospels and the early manuscripts. So to start off, could you talk a little bit about like who you are and like what got you interested in things like this?
Well, I did my PhD about 40 years ago in Southern California at Claremont. And most of my career, for 35 years of it, I taught in Canada. And only in the last 5 years, I've returned to the United States. I'm a dual citizen, and I teach at Houston Baptist University, as you just said. I did my PhD in biblical studies. It had a New Testament tilt, but my dissertation was on Isaiah. I was very interested in how the Old Testament functions in the New. I still have that interest. Fascinated with the prophets, among them Isaiah especially, but also very interested in how Jesus interacted with the prophets, and especially Isaiah, not just in Hebrew, but also the way it was paraphrased in Aramaic, which is called the Targum. Well, this all became very interesting and important when the third quest, as it came to be called, the third quest of the historical Jesus, got underway with a lot of noise in the 1980s. And one of the things about the quest was Jesus should be interpreted as a Jewish person in the Jewish world, and that would include making use of and engaging the Old Testament. So it turned out my own training at Claremont in the PhD program equipped me to be part of this dialogue, and I was. And I had the good fortune of studying with the two original Qumran Dead Sea Scrolls scholars, John Trevor and William Brownlee. And so Jesus and the Scrolls became a big deal. So that's what got me into manuscripts and eventually on into New Testament manuscripts, which is what this book is all about. So that's my background, and it's been a long journey. It's been exciting. It's been fun to get to know scholars around the world, to travel around the world, to actually see the manuscripts, to go to archaeological dig sites, see the artifacts. And I think, Zach, one of the things, the big takeaway is when we talk about the Bible and we talk about Bible stories, biblical history, biblical teaching, it's not just air. It isn't just words. It's not just stuff passed on that, like urban legends or something. But it's very much, there's artifact. These are old documents. They do exist. People were reading them 2,000 years ago. And so there is actual, factual material, artifactual material that backs it up. And that makes that, for me, it's personally a game changer. So we're not building castles in the air, but we're on solid ground.
It's super interesting. So starting off with looking at like reliability, how reliable would you say the ancient manuscripts are? And like, can we trust the authenticity of the New Testament?
Yes, of course we can trust them. And I say that for the reason I just said a moment ago. It isn't because people ask us to trust it or some pastor or priest says so in church. We have the documents. And of course, having ancient documents, it's not just the Bible. I mean, if we have ancient documents relating to all kinds of texts from antiquity, Greek text, Latin text, but Hebrew, Babylonian, you name it. And so the biblical record compares very well. It doesn't just compare well, it's the best. There is no other literary tradition where you have so many manuscripts. And why is that important? It's because you can compare them, put them side by side, different manuscripts. And so they are, they're manuscript. Manu is hand, right? Script is a handwriting. So they're handwritten documents. And when people write things out by hand, just as surely as when people today type or keyboard, they do make mistakes. And when you're copying things, your eye looks at a manuscript and you look back and you write it. You can leave a word out or you can leave out a whole line. Sometimes you repeat a line. So there are mistakes that are made in manuscripts, but no two scribes in two manuscripts make exactly the same mistake. And that's the beauty of it. And so if you've got 10 copies or 100 copies or more than that, and you compare them, you can sniff out where the mistakes have been made. Usually they're pretty obvious. And then you know how to correct it. So you're always able to go back to what the original text was. So we have so many witnesses. It's not like some documents where we don't even have a complete copy, and we know some parts are missing, but we can't restore it. Well, the Bible's not like that at all. We have so many ancient copies. We can compare, we can restore. And so when you buy an English translation of the Bible, the Hebrew Old Testament and the Greek New Testament, you can be confident that you've got the text the way it was written a long time ago.
That's super interesting. I do want to say, for anyone listening, we'll be doing a little bit of Q&A at the end. But for now, why do you believe that the Gospels were written for Christians? It's a very interesting idea. So what are your thoughts there?
Well, we assume that the Gospels were written for Christians because they would be the ones interested in hearing the story. Christendom is 2,000 years old now, and so the Jesus story has been talked about for about 1,990 years. And so it's a little bit old hat to most Christians. If you attend church with any regularity, if you've read the Gospels a few times, you know the details pretty well. But for the very first generation, they didn't all know the details. Jesus's followers knew these things real well. His disciples, of course, knew them very well. But if you lived in Greece or you lived in Italy or North Africa, what do you know? And you hear one or two stories about Jesus. You hear about the words of institution at the Last Supper. You hear about his death, his resurrection. You hear that he's healed people. You've heard something about him being a great teacher, but you don't know the story. And so it was important for these Gospels to be written and circulated, and that's what happened. And that's how people began to know the story of Jesus better. It was because of these Gospels. That's why they had to be written down. And of course, they had to be copied again and again and again. And so they were spread throughout the Roman Empire and beyond.
So it's interesting. In the book, you talk a little bit about the people requesting Mark specifically, according to tradition, to write down the sayings of Peter and stuff. So can you talk a little bit about what that is and kind of how it might play into the gospel being written for Christians?
Yeah, exactly. People were eager. Jesus's teaching was compelling. People wanted to hear it. And it's one thing to hear, word of mouth. And that is the primary way of teaching back in antiquity. And some teacher would speak and his disciples would listen and they'd hear him talk again and again and again, and then they'd go out and speak. But it was better if the teachers themselves, the apostolic teachers and their right-hand aides and assistants, if they'd committed to writing, and then you could disseminate it further and you'd have something a little more stable. It was less likely for the teaching to evolve into forms and emphases that were not authentic and were not really original to what Jesus was talking about. Jesus gave his disciples plenty of latitude. He wanted them to take his teaching and apply it. He says so in Matthew 13. That's the way pedagogy, in fact, was done in antiquity, and not everybody understands that. And so they see a discrepancy where Jesus's words are paraphrased a little bit, and they think, oh, that's a mistake or there's something wrong. Well, no, that's how Jesus taught his disciples. That's how I teach my students. I don't want them simply to repeat my words verbatim. I want to make sure they understand what I'm talking about, and they can put my teachings, my thoughts into their words. That's what Jesus did. And so there is some interpretive paraphrase in the Gospels, and that's just fine. And so that's why Christians know not only what Jesus originally said when he spoke in Aramaic in the year 29 in Israel, but they can hear him now speak in Greek, paraphrase a little bit, so they understand better given the time and place they live in. That's the beauty of the Gospels. That's why there are 4 of them and not just one.
So one of the interesting things you talk about is the book of Matthew enjoying what you call pride and place in the emerging world of the gospel. So what's going on with the book of Matthew here in your research?
Well, The interesting thing about Matthew is of the three synoptic gospels, there are four gospels, but three of them we call synoptic because they can be seen together, and that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're very similar. They cover very similar ground. There's a lot of overlap. And of the three, only Matthew's an apostle. And I think that's one of the reasons why Matthew is very important. The other reason, too, is Matthew is closely connected to the synagogue, closely connected to the Old Testament, wants to show how Jesus fulfills both prophecy and law. And so the prophets, the law and the prophets, that's very important to the Jewish people. And that's where Christianity started, right? Within the synagogue, within the Jewish world. So I'm not surprised that Matthew very quickly, by the end of the first century, had pride of place and maintained that for hundreds of years. And that doesn't mean that, like Augustine was correct. He thought Mark was an abbreviation of Matthew. And I know that's actually, he's got it reversed. Matthew's an expansion of Mark. And that's a good thing because Mark is connected to Peter. Papias, he relays that tradition. The Apostle John, the elder John, taught that, Peter spoke and Mark wrote things down. And that became the principal source for what we call the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Yeah, so one of the things that's really interesting here is we have the synoptics, but then we also have like the Gospel of John, which in many ways people can read it and it can seem very different than the synoptic gospel. So what's the going on with like the ongoing study in the Gospel of John among like biblical scholars and such?
Yeah, John's really complicated and a difficult one simply because, it's like he's going in different directions. On the one hand, Jesus sounds so different from the Jesus in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So the Johannine Jesus seems different from the synoptic Jesus, you might say. And so about the time you think, oh, well, maybe John is a totally different kind of a genre, very mystical, metaphorical, parabolic, or whatever. And then surprise, John is loaded with topographical and geographical features, place names, very accurate information about Jerusalem in the first century and its environs. So much so that any archaeologist that's interested in first century Jerusalem wouldn't think of doing work without consulting John, because John is so full of accurate information about what Jerusalem was like. These various landmarks, pools, the temple, all those sort of things. So John, on the one hand, exhibits great verisimilitude. That is, it just reveals so accurately the way things were. And yet, Jesus comes across in such a different way, speaks so metaphorically. And so I think what we have there is, in the synoptics, it's very Petrine, Peter tradition. These are his stories. Matthew, Mark, and Luke make use of them in the way they write their respective gospels. But you have a very different author behind John. Some think it could be connected to Lazarus, somebody who's not from Galilee, somebody who lives in Bethany, somebody who was personally acquainted with the servants of the high priest, a person who's an eyewitness, and that's what John says. And a person, and if the fourth gospel, even if it is connected to John, if it's also connected to Lazarus, then you're talking about somebody raised from the dead. And maybe that's why he has such an interest in the whole question of life. And to believe in Jesus is to receive eternal life. And, he could be speaking from experience. So I think he's had a very different life experience. He lives in a different place. He reflects just a whole different tradition. And that's why John is so different in so many ways. And yet it's eyewitness testimony. So I see it very valuable. You have the northern tradition, the Galilean tradition, Petrine tradition, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And then you have this distinctive southern tradition connected to, we call it John, but it's someone from the south, maybe Lazarus or somebody like that. And I think that just adds to the testimony. That just enriches it. So it's not just one stream of tradition, but we got two very important streams of tradition talking about Jesus. And I think that's quite significant in a good way.
Mm. So in your view then, like with like who wrote the Gospel of John, 'cause that's what people always wonder. Would you say that you'd lean towards maybe like someone like Lazarus writing it, or do you think it was like John? Like what do you think with regards to like who wrote the Gospel according to John?
Yeah, well, the church has always said John.
Hmm.
And so there's a reason for that. And I don't think the early church made up names. That just doesn't make any sense, because if you're just going to make up names, like, heretics in the second and third centuries who created later gospels, they made up names. So they claim, well, this is the gospel according to Thomas. Thomas wrote it. Or this is the gospel according to Judas. Or this is the gospel according to Mary or Philip or somebody else like that. And they will often take these fictional names and insert them in the narrative itself. So, I, John, was on the Mount of Olives praying, and suddenly the heavens lit up and it's Jesus.
Mm.
And so they're really wearing it on their sleeve, their claims of apostolic authorship. Well, the authentic early first century gospels don't do that. It's all about Jesus. Here's what he taught, and this is what happened. It's not all about who's the writer. And so when the early church says, well, Mark is the author of Mark, I think that's authentic, because if you're going to make it up, why not say it's Peter? Peter is the voice. He is the teaching behind Mark. So why not just call it the Gospel of Peter? Well, it's because I think the early church realized that, no, it was Mark who actually wrote it. And so there's a modesty there. There's a commitment to truth. And when you think about Matthew, who's Matthew? He's a name on a list. There's only one story in the Gospels, and that's Matthew, the tax collector. When he decides to follow Jesus, he has a reception, invites people to come and meet Jesus. That's the only story we have Matthew. He does not show up in the book of Acts. He's a name on a list. And then when it comes to Luke, who's Luke? He's not one of the original disciples. He's a traveling companion with Paul in his third journey. Second, maybe, and third journey. So you get these we first person plural sections in Acts. Well, who's Luke? He's not one of the original 12. So you see this modesty in selecting names. So it doesn't strike me as pulling names out of an impressive hat. So the Gospels are kind of glossed and upgraded. There seems to be a commitment, however modest it may be, a commitment to truth. And if the truth is modest, so be it. You have that in the resurrection accounts. Fictional stories from a later time will exaggerate the resurrection witnesses, like the Gospel of Peter, which I talk about in my book, or the Acts of Pilate. These are later second, third century fictions that greatly embellish the stories. But the first century Gospels say, well, it was women. The first to find the tomb empty and meet Jesus, that's Mary Magdalene. Well, boy, that doesn't sound like, anybody's writing fiction to impress skeptics. This is just telling the truth. And it was the fact that it was Mary Magdalene who was the first to go to the tomb, find it empty, and see the risen Jesus. So this a commitment to telling the truth, even if the truth isn't overly impressive, that impresses me. And in contrast to later writings that exaggerate and embellish.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Moving on here in your book, you deal with like the oldest manuscripts inside the Christian canon, but then also like looking outside of the Christian canon. So like in this whole book, which is 500 pages, it's a lot of great stuff in there. What are some of the conclusions that you come to in this book?
Well, a lot of conclusions. One, where we started, the manuscripts for the New Testament Gospels are numerous, and they're very early, and they're of good quality. The idea that these were written by sloppy people who don't know what they're doing is just absurd. The evidence doesn't support that. The other thing, Zach, that's very important to know, and this is so key. When the first scribes that were making copies, they didn't have any motivation to change anything. The idea that somebody, the Dan Brown, Da Vinci Code kind of thinking, that somebody would alter the gospel text to jazz it up a little bit, there's no evidence of that. And, the orthodoxy is officially defined in the 4th century. Well, how would anyone know at the end of the 1st century or beginning of the 2nd century? How would anyone know what orthodoxy would be eventually settled on? They wouldn't know.
Mm.
How would they know which writings would make up a New Testament? How would they know there would be a New Testament? So this whole idea, this conspiracy idea of somebody messing around with the Gospels to change them or to choose certain ones, ultimately behind it is anachronism. It's as though somebody in the 2nd century knows the thinking of the 4th century. Well, of course, no one did. And so it's really silly. The other thing, Zach, that's a real game changer. We have reason to believe that most of these scribes in the 1st and 2nd century were professional scribes. They weren't necessarily Christian at all. So they don't have a dog in the fight. Why would some professional scribe, his only qualification is he's a good scribe. He doesn't make very many mistakes. Well, is he going to change what he's copying? How would he has no motivation to make any changes. He wouldn't know how to make any changes. Why would he do that? So he makes a copy of Matthew as accurately and carefully as he can. Same with Mark, same with Luke, same with John. So yeah, that's why I think there's no question about it. We have a lot of manuscripts. They're very early. We can compare them and make sure, what the original reading is. And the early scribes, for the most part, they were just professional scribes, and they wouldn't know how to make any changes, even if it even occurred to them. So there you go.
That's interesting. So like talking about these professional scribes who are copying the Gospels, like if they don't have like, so to speak, like a horse in the race, they're just like professional scribes. Why are they copying these Gospels?
They're paid to. That's their job. That's why. It's what they do. It's their job. And they're paid per line. And so that's what they do. And so they're looking for work. And so they're not top-end scribes. They're not the guys that would do beautiful calligraphy, beautiful handwriting, but they're kind of B-plus scribes. And it's only when Christianity comes into its own in the 4th century and beyond that the budgets get bigger. And so really good scribes, and they're writing on leather, parchment, in the 4th century and 5th century. But up to then, it's just cheaper papyrus, and it's not an A scribe who would charge a whole lot of money, but they're workmanlike, they're competent scribes who are accurate, and they're legible. And so I'd call them B-plus scribes, and they're the ones that are hired. And yeah, some of them might have been Christian, but most of them were not. They're just professional scribes hired to do a job.
I like that, B-plus scribes. It's a great way of thinking about it. So moving on here, like you in the book you talk about like the oldest witnesses to like the life of Jesus. So like what are these oldest witnesses, and like why I think they're trustworthy? Because you were talking about that a little bit earlier.
Yeah, well, the oldest witnesses are the Gospels, and so I'm hoping readers will get that through their heads. It's not like what Dan Brown wants you to believe. The oldest witnesses are not Gospels that were excluded. The Gospels that never made their way into the canon weren't written until the 2nd and 3rd century, so they're later. The Gospels that are in the canon are the oldest ones. The so-called Q source, I think there was a source, of Jesus' sayings floating around, nurtured and preserved and cultivated by church leaders in churches. And that the teaching of Peter that Mark wrote down, that stuff gets merged together, and that's how you end up with Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because they have so much common material. That's the early stuff, and that's what we have in the Bible. Later stuff becomes new versions, supplementing it, changing it, introducing new ideas. And because they had just, the church was some parts of the church losing its Jewish connection. And after these 3 Jewish wars, the first one, 66 to 70, the second one, 115, 117, third one, the Bar Kokhba War, 132 to 135, there was anti-Semitism. It's kind of like in the world today. There was anti-Semitism in the Roman Empire. And so there were branches of people that were kind of in the church, said, oh, this Jesus guy is interesting, but let's make him less Jewish. I don't like the Jewish thing. Let's introduce Greek philosophy. Let's have Jesus sound more like Plato. And so, you had guys writing new Gospels. They're a mixture of the Jesus tradition, but a mixture of stuff that who knows where that came from. And the church was wise and said, we're not including stuff like that. And by the way, when I say include, that's anachronistic, really. what the beginnings of canon was the decision on whether or not it would be read in church. And so you have bishops who would write and say to the pastors, yeah, you can read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in the church, and Paul's letters. Go ahead and read them. That's good. You should. But don't read the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Peter, or don't read this Gnostic stuff. It's not edifying. It's full of false teaching. So that's the beginning of canon.
It's super interesting. So like looking especially like with regards to the Gospels, like how accurate is the dating? Like when would you date these Gospels? And like when they're written, and like how accurate do you think that would be?
Well, you know, Zach, when we talk about dating, we're talking about two things really. We're talking about dating the artifacts themselves, and then we're talking about dating when we think the person wrote the text originally, and we don't have the original document. If we had the autograph, that would sure help. But carbon-14 always gives you a plus or minus about 50 years. And so that doesn't help a whole lot. So dating the artifacts, yeah, that's why we can say we have a few fragments of the New Testament Gospels that date to the 2nd century. One fragment, P52, it's just a couple of verses of John chapter 18, could date to the first half of the 2nd century. So in other words, you know, the 120s to 140s or 50s, somewhere in there, maybe. Then we have a few other fragments, Matthew and one or two other fragments, maybe John, that date to the end of the 2nd century. But so you have to get into the 3rd century before you have big chunks of text and all of the text. So that's one kind of way of dating. But the other word, you know, the other idea of dating is, well, when did these guys write these things down? There are various ways of evaluating that, and scholars do disagree. I tend to tilt toward early. I didn't at the beginning of my career, but in more recent years, I tilt earlier. So I think all three synoptic gospels were written before the Jewish War started in 66. About John, I'm not sure. John, I think I'm going with the traditional date of the 90s. That's what the church fathers always said. But I don't know. John could be earlier. John could be 60s also. I just don't know. My mind is open on that. But the Gospel of Thomas, you know, I've argued in my book, 2 chapters in the book, Thomas can't be dated any earlier than 180. So it's late 2nd century. Gospel of Peter should not be dated any earlier than 140 or 150. And most of the other writings are later still.
It's interesting. So one interesting question here is like the idea of, we'll get to Thomas and Peter hopefully in a minute, but like to what extent did like non-Christian scribes and scholars trust the earliest texts? Like we'd assume that like the Christians trust them, but like what were the non-Christians thinking about like the early texts of like the Gospels and such?
Oh, nobody, excuse me. Nobody really debated the dates of the Gospels. You know, the critics, the non-Christian critics of Christianity, like Celsus, they knew the Gospels were written in the 1st century. They didn't even doubt the general reliability and truthfulness of the Gospels. What they disputed, like Celsus, you know, Celsus is writing 160 to 170, somewhere in there. And what Celsus is responding to is the idea that, well, because Jesus performed miracles, because he walked on water, because his teaching was excellent, Celsus say, yeah, okay, maybe he performed a few miracles, maybe he was a good teacher, but that doesn't make him the Son of God. Doesn't make him the Savior. And so Celsus didn't dispute the general truthfulness. I'm sure he did dispute the truthfulness of a few stories, but the general truthfulness of the Gospels, he didn't dispute. He didn't say, you know, Matthew didn't write Matthew, or the Gospels weren't as early as we think, or they weren't written in the 1st century. He didn't say that stuff. He ignored the Gospel of Thomas. He probably didn't even know Thomas existed when he did his writing, because Thomas probably didn't exist yet. But Celsus just simply disagreed with the Christian conclusions and the Christian inferences, you know, and Celsus was skeptical about the resurrection. He seems open to the possibility that there was a resurrection. But I don't know. I think Celsus just says, you know, that's not enough to claim to be God. That's not quite enough to claim that you're the Son of God and Savior. just because you performed a few miracles. That's the interesting thing. But this other stuff, when the Gospels were written or who wrote them, I don't think Celsus, as a skeptic, questioned any of that.
That, to me, that's just super interesting to think about, and I'm sure it is the same for you and everyone else listening. I just say in about like 15-20 minutes, we're going to go to a little bit of Q&A on the way out. So if you have questions, we'll get to a little bit at the end, or if you send out a super chat, you can support the channel and stuff. That always helps. But one of the things you talk about is this idea of the Jewish Gospels. So what do you mean by that, and what's going on there?
Well, there were some very early, in fact, those are the earliest Gospels that follow the New Testament Gospels, or the ones we call Jewish Gospels. They seem to be connected to Matthew. They seem to be new versions of Matthew. Zach, it's real hard to evaluate them because they don't survive. All we have are quotations by church fathers well into the 2nd century, and typically much later, 3rd century, 4th century, 5th century. And they'll say, oh, by the way, here's this great story. It's found in Matthew chapter whatever. And there's a different version of it that's in the Gospel of the Hebrews. We don't have the Gospel of the Hebrews. So then you get this part of this different version is quoted. That's all. And so you might have 12 or 15 quotations of the Gospel of the Hebrews, or the Gospel of the Nazarenes, or the Gospel of the Ebionites, and you just get a handful of quotations. And the reason those quotations were even quoted was because they're different. And think about that, So here's a document that's lost. We don't know how long it is. We don't know what all's in it. And all that survives of it are a dozen quotations of passages where it's different from Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. And so what I infer from that is that it probably was very similar to Matthew and Mark, and the church fathers just found them interesting because they happen to be a little bit different in a few places. And we think they were written in the early 2nd century, probably somewhere between 120 and 140. So that's what I mean about the Jewish Gospels. So they're probably not that remarkable or that unusual, like the later Gospel of Thomas or Gospel of Peter or some of the Gnostic Gospels.
That's super interesting. So talking about some of these like interesting texts here that like aren't canonical, such as like the Gospel of Thomas, can you talk about like what becomes of the Gospel of Thomas and why isn't it a part of the New Testament?
Well, I don't think Thomas wanted to be part of the New Testament. That's really funny. There's a book out there called A New Testament, okay? And it thinks that, the Gospel of Thomas should be included. In fact, it should be the first gospel, which I find arrogant and foolish. And what does the Thomas say? How does the Gospel of Thomas begin? And in this case, we have the whole thing because it was translated into the Coptic language, the Egyptian language, and then put in somebody's tomb. And that's why it survives the whole thing. Otherwise, we only have 3 small fragments adding up to about 22% of the whole text in Greek. But we have a Coptic translation of the entire thing. And how does it begin? It starts off by saying, these are the secret words that the living Jesus spoke, and Judas Didymus Thomas wrote down. Well, this is normally secret stuff isn't canonized because remember, secret means you keep it as secret. You don't read it publicly. And books to be included in the canon are read publicly. So that's the problem. So this whole idea that the church excluded Thomas, or, there's some conspiracy going on, is silly. It's wrongheaded from the very beginning. So whoever wrote Thomas didn't want it to be read publicly. And when he wrote it, toward the end of the 2nd century, say 180 or something like that, he knew perfectly well that secret books weren't canonical books because they couldn't be read in public. It wouldn't be a secret book anymore if you were reading it out loud in a public setting. So that's one of the things that's so silly about it. And most of these Gnostic writings, and Thomas at best is semi-Gnostic, the Gnostic writings like the Gospel of Mary or Gospel of Philip or Gospel of Judas and so on, these were all secret writings. And so I don't think any of them claimed to be canonical. They weren't advocating, let me into the canon, They presumed the canonical public books that were read. They'd say, come over here, you've heard the public Jesus, that everybody knows. Now I got the secret Jesus for you. I'll give you the straight skinny. So come on over here in secret, if you join our little tiny group, you get to read this and really get smart and find out what's going on. So that's what that stuff. They never wanted to be in the canon. That would undermine its whole purpose.
Huh. That's super interesting. Another thing you refer to in your book along similar lines is what you call like a fifth gospel, the Gospel of Peter. So why is it called like the cross gospel? An interesting name for it, at least I think. And like, why isn't the Gospel of Peter included in our New Testament?
Yeah, well, okay. In the case of the Gospel of Peter, I think it was interested in getting included in the canon.
Uh-huh.
And a bishop, a guy named Bishop Serapion, oversaw some churches in Syria, and he allowed the Gospel of Peter to be read, which meant he thought it was okay and canonical. So go ahead and read Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Peter if you like. Then he read it and found out what was in it and said, oh, wait a minute, just a second, hold it, stop, don't read it anymore. Okay, so it was canonical for a little while and then lost out. Now, why? Why do we call it the cross gospel? Well, first of all, Zach, we don't have all of it. We have a large chunk. It starts with Pontius Pilate washing his hands and letting Jesus be crucified. And then it goes right up through the passion story to the resurrection. We call it the cross gospel because the cross of Jesus comes out of the tomb when Jesus is resurrected. And of course, the whole story is fantastic. Jesus's head reaches up into the clouds. 2 angels come out with him. Their heads go up into the clouds. And this cross comes bounding out of the tomb following Jesus. And then the voice from heaven cries out, have you preached to them that sleep, that is to the dead? And Jesus doesn't answer. The angels don't answer. It's the cross. The cross, I guess, looks up to heaven and says, yes. So this is why it's called the cross gospel. And that was suggested by John Dominic Crossan, a scholar who worked on it 35 years ago. And he tried to argue that this story was the original story, that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are based on it. And nobody buys that today. I'm not sure if Crossan himself buys it anymore. No, the Gospel of Peter was written in the middle of the 2nd century. And its purpose was to answer the skeptics like Celsus. Celsus going around saying, why should we believe that Jesus was really significant, a son of God, or resurrected in a special way? Who saw all this? Hysterical women. This woman that used to have an evil spirit, Mary Magdalene, from a wretched village. He doesn't know what he's talking about, by the way, because Mary Magdalene was from Magdala, which was like Newport Beach, if you know anything about California. Nobody had called Newport Beach or Laguna Beach a wretched little village. But anyway, he didn't know that. And on the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee, Magdala, before it was destroyed by the Romans in 66, 67 AD, was a fantastic town. So she was from an upscale waterfront property. And of course, he says, oh, well, who is she? Who cares what she thinks? He's very chauvinist. Women don't count. They're terrible witnesses. And so what the Gospel of Peter is doing is saying, hey, just a minute, I can tell the story differently. The risen Jesus appeared to Jewish elders, to all the Roman soldiers, to the Roman centurion, actually gives him a name, calls him Petronius. And they all went and told Pilate. Why? Then the whole city of Jerusalem comes out, runs to the tomb. They see angels coming up and down from heaven and everything else. And so I think what the Gospel of Peter is reckless apologetic. It's very exaggerated. It's trying to answer the question of why should we believe Jesus is divine? Why should we believe he's resurrected? Because everybody saw him get resurrected. And he had divine features. I mean, my gosh, his head went up into the clouds. Only a God could do that. So that's what the Gospel of Peter is. It's not historical. It's just reckless 2nd century apologetic. And the church was wise to see it for what it was and say, forget it, you're not getting into the New Testament.
That's super interesting. I have a couple more questions for you, and then we're gonna go to a little bit of Q&A at the end here. But there's very little in the Gospels about like the childhood of Jesus, which is something so interesting because I think so many people wonder, like, well, what happened between like when he was born and when he's 30 and he's beginning his ministry? So why do you think there's such silence in the Gospels about the childhood of Jesus?
Well, it's a good question, and I'm not surprised at all because Jesus's ministry gets underway as an adult. And the New Testament teaches the incarnation, meaning that Jesus's humanity is real, and that would mean his childhood is real. And so there's a natural tendency later, and you see this in the second and third centuries, to exaggerate Jesus's childhood. So you get all this speculation about Jesus as an infant, healing people, doing amazing things, miracles, and so on. That's fiction. There's only one story we have in the Gospels, the first century Gospels. That's Jesus as a 12-year-old who gets left behind when his parents join the caravan to go back up north to Galilee after Passover. Jesus hangs around in Jerusalem. There he is. A day later, they find him, and he's in the temple precincts with the teachers. It's interesting. Again, this is an example of restraint. If the Gospels wanted to exaggerate, the Gospel writers knew perfectly well that there were all kinds of legends and stories about Moses, about Roman emperors, prodigies when they were, young kids. They they did all kinds of amazing things. If you're not committed to truth, if you're not committed to history, why not make up a bunch of stories about Jesus? As in fact some did 100 years, 200 years later in what we call the infancy Gospels. But Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John don't do that. And so you have only one story with Jesus as a boy. And what does he do? He doesn't walk on water. He doesn't make clay pigeons fly. He's in the temple discussing theology and Bible with the professors. That's it. And Mary treasures this in her heart. So if you were to find the historical Mary and say, what do you remember about Jesus when he was a young lad? She'd say, man, he was keen about scripture and theology. He liked to talk about God. That's what I remember. This stuff later when he's a boy and can stretch boards and make clay pigeons fly and do all kinds of strange things. That's the same kind of imagination like we see in the Gospel of Peter. That's just reckless, apologetic, and imagination. And the church was wise to say that's baloney. It has no place in the Bible.
So you kind of end this book by talking about how you can really just have there's not room for much doubt with regards to the Christian canon. Like we have a very solid understanding of what's going on here. So what does that mean? And does that mean that we can trust the Bible completely?
Yeah, well, it does. And of course, the Bible invites serious study. The real question about the Bible is understanding it. It isn't so much the historicity. I mean, the historical parts of the Bible are well established with other historical records and archaeology. That's why I confidently talk about the Gospels. They exhibit verisimilitude. If they were pious fictions, like some of these later Gospels, then they wouldn't exhibit verisimilitude. But what do I mean by that? Well, they talk about real places, real people, real events. And we can confirm that by other sources, including archaeology. So I know a bunch of archaeologists. I'm going to Israel later in the year and to film a documentary. And we'll interview a whole bunch of archaeologists. Most of them are not Christians. Some of them don't necessarily believe in God. But they all make use of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Book of Acts, and the Jewish historian Josephus. Why? Because those guys are accurate. They talk about real people, real places, real things. And so no archaeologist would fail to consult the Gospels when he's getting ready to dig in a certain place. And he's got 50 to 100 volunteers who will dig for the next 4 weeks in a certain place. They're going to move tons and tons of debris. There's a lot of expense. You're not going to dig in a wrong place. You're not going to dig somewhere and you have no idea if there's anything there to find. So archaeologists, and I know this from experience, archaeologists regularly make use of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the 4 Gospels, and the Book of Acts regularly, even if they're Jewish or agnostic or whatever. They make use of the Gospels. Why? Because they find them accurate. And they find them reliable. So they use them to help them know where to dig and how to understand what they dig up. Well, man, to me, that's a big vote. in favors. They don't have a dog in the fight, or as you
Hmm.
said, a horse in the race. It's like, well, I'm not a Christian, I'm just this guy, I'm an archaeologist, but I'm not going to have 100 people dig in the wrong spot and
Yeah.
move 20 tons of earth, and it's all for nothing. I want to be sure we're digging in the right place, so I will use whatever sources help me find the right place and understand it correctly. Oh, and by the way, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the book of Acts are sources that do just that. And so they use them even though they don't go to church or don't necessarily worship Jesus or believe in God. And to me, that is a real indicator that the Gospels are in fact recognized as accurate and reliable.
That's super helpful and super informative to think about. So thank you about that. What we're gonna do now is go to a little bit of Q&A. So I've seen a couple questions, and if there's a little more, we're gonna do about for the next 10 minutes here. But Susan has a super chat, so thank you so much for supporting the show and your super chat, Susan. And it says, does Dr. Evans believe that the gospel writers were felt free to add, delete, or change the time of events, or put words in Jesus' mouth that he did not say for theological reasons, such as like the I am statements?
No, I wouldn't. That's going way too far. I don't say that. They're not putting words in his mouth. They're paraphrasing. I mean, if you can get real pedantic about it, the gospel writers write Jesus's words in Greek. I think Jesus could speak Greek, but I think most of his teaching, maybe all of his teaching, was Aramaic. So just because they translate, and anytime you translate, if you know anything about two or more languages, Susan, if you speak Spanish or something like that, or German, you realize there's always paraphrase that goes on. The idea is to be accurate, to get the right meaning, not so much word for word. So, I mean, that would be terrible to say that, oh, you're putting words in Jesus's mouth. You're putting all these Greek words in his mouth that he never spoke. Well, nobody would think that. So that's not putting words in his mouth. Second and third century people do, where they have Jesus teach things that he never taught. So that's not what I'm talking about. So what I'm talking about is in translating Jesus's Aramaic teaching into Greek, which is what the Gospels are. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the original Gospels, are written in Greek. There is paraphrasing that goes on. There is interpretation, but it's not to put words in Jesus's mouth. It's to make sure that his words are correctly understood, that the meaning, what he was talking about in context, is correctly understood. And so that's all. That's all that I mean by that.
That's very helpful. Another question here from BDS, which says, what's the best way to respond to the idea that like Jesus did not exist, or that like Yahweh is just a pagan god? What are your thoughts here, Dr. Evans? Because I know there's very rich scholarship on Jesus mythicism, right?
Yeah, and BDS, thank you for the question. I wrote an article on mythicism in Christian Scholars Review, I don't know, about 4 years ago. And if you send an email to Zach with a request, I'll send that paper to Zach and he can send it to you. But it's in Christian Scholars Review, or Christian Scholars Journal, I think is the name of it. I'll tell you, that mythicist thing, you need a lobotomy. I mean, my goodness, that is so sad. And there are, literally thousands of historians around the world, many of them not necessarily Christians, not necessarily theists, and they think it's the stupidest thing going. You have to ignore all of the evidence, everything becomes either false or manipulated. It turns into a grand conspiracy of some sort. I debated Richard Carrier, when was it? I think it was in, 5 years ago, maybe, in Atlanta. And what I challenged him with was, well, if Jesus didn't exist, how do you have so many people talking about him when in the very time he didn't exist? I mean, you need some kind of time. You need at least 100 years. You need some kind of a gap. And yet Paul himself, the Apostle Paul, whose letters, the authentic letters, are not disputed, and all we have to do is talk about two of them, the one called Galatians and the one called 1 Corinthians, and Richard Carrier does not dispute the authenticity of those two letters. He does not doubt that there was a real Paul and that he wrote those letters. Well, the guy wrote those letters, late 40s, early 50s, and he's talking about Jesus's family and his original apostles, Peter and John and others. And he talks about the Lord's brother, James.
Mm.
Well, as Bart Ehrman, I mentioned Bart Ehrman because, right, he's an apostate. He's not a Christian, right? And he wrote a book called Did Jesus Exist? And he concluded, well, of course he existed. The evidence for Jesus' existence is simply overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
And he says something that I think is wonderful. I love, and I know Bart personally. He said, if Jesus didn't exist, you'd think his brother James would have known that. Good point. And Paul knows him. And of course, what Richard Carrier says is, well, he calls him brother, but it's metaphysical. It's kind of, we're all brothers. Yeah, well, that's not what's in the New Testament.
Mm.
There's only one person called the brother of Jesus or brother of the Lord, and that's James. Nobody else. Paul calls him that. He doesn't call Peter the brother of the Lord. He doesn't call John the brother of the Lord or Barnabas the brother of the Lord, just James. So that argument doesn't work. And that's why nobody doubts that Jesus existed. The Gospels, again, exhibit verisimilitude. They're talking about real people, real places, and Jesus is real too.
So one thing I wonder here is like, what, like, if you're gonna like hold like some sort of criteria, like with your historical methodology where you get to the conclusion that Jesus doesn't exist, like when you get into like antiquity, how many people could you actually believe like with certainty that like they exist? Like if you doubt like say the existence of Jesus, are you gonna have to doubt like Julius Caesar or like Augustus? Like how do you how far do you go if you kind of go with this like crazy skeptical methodology?
Yeah, it's almost a form of solipsism in philosophy where it's like, well, I know I exist, but I don't know if anything else exists. And that's really dumb. That's a dumb way to argue. And if you want to be consistent with that kind of skepticism, where 4 first century biographies don't count, where Paul's letters don't count, where Josephus doesn't count either, early 2nd century Greco-Roman writers don't count either, and on it goes. In other words, you dismiss all the evidence. No evidence is high enough, measures up to your great, glorious, illustrious standards. Well, then you just as well write off all of ancient history. You may as well throw out Alexander the Great. I mean, the evidence for Jesus is more compelling than Alexander the Great. So what do you do? And of course, I've had mythicists say, well, you'd think if Jesus was so important as everybody thinks he is, that there'd be more first century stuff. Well, again, there's anachronism behind that. The huge importance of Jesus becomes known throughout the Roman Empire by the 4th century. But why would we expect 4th century sensitivities and knowledge to be available and known throughout the Roman Empire in the 1st century? I mean, it's anachronistic. So stop and think about it. You've got 4 first century biographies talking about Jesus. Do you realize the only other people from antiquity that are equal to that or close to it are Roman emperors? So Jesus compares rather well, actually, when you think about it. We know an awful lot about Jesus, and he's somebody from an obscure village from Galilee. And yet he compares rather well with the 1st century Roman emperors. So, what do you expect? And so when you start raising the bar so high and demand that kind of proof and evidence and so on, you're playing a double game, a double standard. It doesn't have to be that high for others, but for Jesus, super high. Oh, really? So if you're consistent, then either you throw out all of history or you don't want to do that, then you leave Jesus in history.
That's super interesting. But we are around at the end of our time here, Dr. Evans. So do you have anything like last thoughts, things you didn't get to say before we wrap things up here?
Well, I think I could wrap it up by saying, look, the evidence for the existence of Jesus is simply overwhelming, and that's recognized around the world. So if you want to join the mythicist crowd, you're joining a weird cult. Please understand that. You're to believe Jesus exists doesn't mean you have to be a Christian or even believe in God. Okay. The other thing to know is that the Gospels are early. Their manuscripts are early. Their manuscripts are numerous. They show that they're written by competent scribes, know what they're doing. there really is no question about what the Gospels originally said. And they are so early, especially Matthew, Mark, and Luke, so early that the idea they're full of stories and things Jesus never really did or never really said would be exposed for the fraud they would be, because they're just so early. There are too many people still living, too many people that remember what Jesus said and did. And by the way, don't forget, why does anyone follow him? If he really is just an ordinary guy who couldn't seem to say anything that anyone could remember, and he didn't do anything, and he wasn't resurrected either, why are we even talking about it? There were plenty of people that did nothing and then died. They don't have any following. There were plenty of people, Josephus tells us about them, who made big claims and they got killed, and that was the end of their movement. But there's only one, Jesus, who did things and said things and amazed people and was raised up and turned his whole otherwise defeated movement, turned it around, converting not only his own following, but indifferent people and even enemies like Saul of Tarsus, who becomes Paul the Apostle. So think it through, get a good grasp of the big picture. And I think you'll see, hey, the Gospels tell a very compelling and well backed up story.
Well, it's been so much fun having you on, Dr. Evans. I encourage everyone, great book here. I've just started reading it, but it's so much fun, Jesus in the Manuscript, so it's definitely worth reading. So I encourage everyone to check that out. I forgot to link it below in the beginning, but as soon as we're off here, I'm going to link it down in the description. I'm sure you can find it on Amazon or anything like that. So I'd encourage everyone to check out that book. And if you enjoy our channel, always feel free to subscribe to Adherent Apologetics on YouTube or podcast. And if you enjoy this show, just hit a like on your way out. And if you enjoy our content, you can support us on patreon.com/adherentapologetics for as little as $1 a month. Your support means a lot. But Dr. Evans, thank you so much for your time. It's been so much fun talking with you. So just thank you.
You're very welcome, Zach. Glad to do it.
And thank you, everyone who tuned in. Michelle, Susan, J. Mike, BDS, everyone else. Have a good one, and God bless.